Content warning. These stories involve attempted robberies and assault. They describe tense moments of danger and trauma. They thought NYC never sleeps. Until these 9 nightmares happened. New York hums at all hours, neon sirens, the subway's constant sigh. That promise of life, of people everywhere, is the reason so many of us move here or visit, the idea that the city is never truly empty. But over the course of 9 nights, that same city became a stage for a set of calculated betrayals. Ordinary hours folded into moments that felt like being emptied out of the city itself, left alone with someone who had rehearsed how to make you small and silent. These are true accounts from survivors, 9 ways the city's loose edges were used against them. Each one is told close up, in the sound of a heartbeat and the scrape of a shoe on concrete. The lure that looked like help, the small hesitation that cost seconds, the object that flashed and turned ordinary into threat. I'll tell you exactly what happened to them, what they smelled and heard and touched, and how, in most cases, they made the tiny decisions that bought them a chance to live through the night. After the first story, there's one simple ask. If you find these survivor voices important, like and subscribe. It helps get more of their stories out. Nightmare 19. The rooftop trap. He said the rooftop view would make my feed blow up. I was in Brooklyn for 48 hours, and the sun was still low when I met him. I had my dad's Nikon slung over my shoulder, the one with the nicked leather strap that always felt like a tether home. He was polite, the kind of person who knows the camera language. What lens are you using? And he pointed at a building that looked like any other brick block, until he said the word rooftop. He promised a view away from the scaffolding, a secret vantage where the skyline leaned in closer. We climbed a service stair behind a locked door. At first I didn't notice the silence, no hum from an air unit, no play of radio from a neighbor's window. He moved like someone confident in that quiet, his voice small, so it wouldn't echo. When he opened the hatch, the air smelled of old dust and metal. The rooftop was narrow. A storage shed sat like a tooth in the center. He suggested we step inside for a quick fix to the camera angle and shut the door behind us. The change was a tiny thing at first. The soft click of a lock, the way his smile stopped working at the edges. He mentioned the nickname Kevin, like it was the name you used when you wanted to be trusted. I remember the glint, a thin blade catching sunlight as he slid a box cutter from his pocket, the metal warming against his thumb. The room was small, the window high, the street below smudged and distant. His tone was steady, practiced. He told me to hand over the camera. When I hesitated, he said he'd only take what he needed and that I should be grateful he wasn't worse. There was a small crack behind a stack of abandoned chairs. I'd already scoped the room when we came in. A fire extinguisher mounted crookedly by the door. A peeling sticker that read, "Last Inspection." My hands went to it while he spoke. I pulled the pull pin as if I were fumbling with a broken strap. The metal felt wrong in my palm, cold and heavier than I thought. He lunged for the camera. I yanked the extinguisher and sprayed. For a second, the room dissolved into white, an acidic cloud that choked and burned the eyes. He staggered back, wiping at his face, and I sprinted past him through the hatch and down the stairs, breath clawing at my throat. Outside, a neighbor was on her stoop and called 911 before I even thought the number. Police searched the building, but the suspect had already vanished into the maze of rooftops. I kept the Nikon, but when people asked about my trip, my answers shortened into lists. Never alone, never take a stranger's shortcut, never go into staff-only rooms. I never went back to Brooklyn for the kind of photos I used to chase. The city that had felt like a playground felt, for a while, like a trap. Same tactic, different skyline, false companionship that leads you somewhere empty. The next time it happened, the setting was a car at a red light in Harlem, and the mechanism was a delivery truck acting like cover. Nightmare 29. The red light ambush. At a red light in Harlem, a man tapped his gun against my window. Twice. I was driving home from a late shift, the radio low, the streets taking on that after-midnight sheen where puddles turn neon signs into oil paintings. I knew the route like a muscle memory. Left at the deli, 2 minutes past the church, then the long block with the broken streetlight. That night the city felt ordinary in a way that made me glance at my phone with a small relief. A message from my roommate, a promise to be up when I got in. There was a delivery truck stalled halfway through the intersection, a white box with company stickers peeled into abstract shapes. A figure crouched at the side of the truck, his profile lit by the truck's hazard lights. At first I thought he was looking for something he dropped. He was very still, very engaged in the small task of pretending to search a ground that was dry. I rolled down the window to say something about blocking the lane, and he tapped the barrel of a gun to the glass, the sound a dull, chilling knock. The tap was methodical, almost casual. My heart jumped, then slowed into a different rhythm, quick, precise, calculating. He said nothing. The gun's weight a language heavier than words. The truck's box hid his body from the cars behind us, and I realized he'd timed the scene to keep witnesses at a remove. I felt the old social scripts kick in. Don't be rude, cooperate. And then something else, raw and animal, pushed up through all those polite layers. Do not open this door. I floored the gas. Tires screamed, the engine rose up into a howl that matched the pounding in my chest. The truck rocked as I clipped the rear corner, and he disappeared from the window in a scatter of motion. I drove through 2 red lights, cut across a median, and called 911 with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. "Run," the operator said when I told her the gun tapped the glass. "You did the right thing." Police arrived minutes later and took my statement. They said my actions likely prevented something worse, but they also told me that at night these delivery truck setups were common vectors for ambush. After that night my routes changed. I moved neighborhoods. I found myself avoiding the streets where I'd learned to expect truck silhouettes and crouched figures. The city's pulse had always comforted, and now it had a new jagged beat that made me check mirrors for strangers and think twice about letting my guard down at a light. Isolation again, but this time the empty car is literal. The subway's hiss and the pale stare of a man with a knife. Nightmare. 3-9, the tunnel knife. He sat across the aisle and said 4 words I'll never forget. Do not move yet. The late-night subway smells like steel and old coffee. That night, there was also the sharp bite of disinfectant. I'd climbed into a near-empty car and put my backpack at my feet. The lights hummed a steady, tired song. A man boarded 2 stops later, his coat too big for him, eyes that were the color of winter sky, a pale grey blue that made you think of hospital corridors. He sat opposite, 2 seats down, and when the car slowed at the next station he stood, walked toward me and left, only to get back on at the far end of the platform. When he returned, he sat closer, deliberately, his movements calm, like someone who had practiced being unnoticed. At the stop after that, he leaned in and told me quietly, "Do not move yet." The words were an instruction and a warning. There was a utility knife wedge where his fingers curled around the inside of his coat pocket, the edge catching the overhead light in a thin line. The camera system at that line had a sign posted, "Cameras temporarily offline for maintenance." Indeed, the sign was a small rectangle and a bigger invitation. He told me to follow him off the train. The platform swallowed us into an empty stretch where the lights were spaced farther apart and the tiles had a damp sheen. He guided me to a gap in the stairs, where the platform narrowed and the opposite end was a blank wall. He kept his voice low, rehearsed. I felt the direction of his eyes like weight, how they mapped exits and corners and places the cameras would miss. The emergency intercoms were at the far end. The nearest conductor's booth was closed. I had already decided, before I let myself think the words through, that I would not go where he sent me. When he moved toward the edge of the platform, I made a sound, loud, a guttural noise not meant to be pretty, and I ran for the adjoining car, slamming the door into passengers I had not even processed as allies until then. I blurted out the words the city had taught me to say in emergencies. "Help! There's a man with a knife!" Heads snapped up. Someone pressed the emergency stop. Transit police came and took statements. The man with the pale eyes had stepped back into the tunnel and vanished by the time they searched. It left me with a map of tiny habits that I still follow. Never take the end car at night. Always check the status of station cameras if I can, and never move alone to isolated parts of platforms. The pale grey-blue of his eyes is an image that visits me few times a month, in flashes when I'm standing on an empty platform with a phone that refuses to load. 3 times, 3 methods. A rooftop that became a room, a truck that became a screen, a subway car that became an empty stage. None of these attacks relied on brute force alone. They were exercises in removing witnesses and making people doubt what they already knew about safety. Nightmare 49, the mass path pickup. The blue route changed and the GPS stopped replying. LaGuardia had been cold and congested. My flight was late and my patience was even later. When the Uber showed, it matched the plate and the photo. The driver's name read the same as the one the app displayed. I slid into the back seat, the kind of seat that in the dark puts you sideways, out of reach of an open passenger door. We pulled away from the terminal, winding through flashes of airport lights, and then the route on my phone started to bend south into an industrial grid I didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the car was wrong in a low, constant way. The driver's voice was flat, his jokes landing like they were rehearsed for other people. He asked where I was headed, then offered a shortcut that ran us through a series of warehouses and loading docks. The window on my side squealed when pressed. When I tried to roll it down a fraction, it resisted like something had blocked the mechanism. He kept one hand near the gear shift, where the Uber's driver-side tag rested like a talisman. When he pulled into a dock space at a shuttered warehouse, my stomach dropped. The dim overhead lights threw large shadows, and the air smelled of oil and cold machine. He said it would be a minute while he handled some paperwork. My phone screen lagged when I hit the panic button in the app. The emergency feature took extra seconds to connect because the network was patchy there. I held the phone in my hand and watched the dots on the map slide away from the highway line I knew and into a nameless patch of grey. I hit the emergency help again. He grunted, his calm splintering into something like doubt. He backed the car up and said a string of words I didn't need to pass. "It's fine, you're fine." When he drove off, he left me very ordinary in the seat, and very aware of the distance between the place where he could trap me and the place where other cars stopped. He stopped again on a residential street, rolled down his window, and told me to get out. I did, hands shaking, and walked quickly toward the nearest lit front door, calling the dispatch as I went. Police were called, the driver sped off before they arrived, and my report joined a growing file of patterns investigators had already noticed. After that, I always sat in the back left seat and kept the Uber app open to the navigation screen. I checked the plate 3 times. I keep a finger over the emergency button, even if it's just a tremor. The city's airport highways had been a liminal space for me until that night. Now they were another place to watch. 2 men who block you by movement, one who reroutes you by silence. The scripts change, but the logic is the same. What comes next is a stairwell and a funnel, a place designed to move bodies in one direction. Nightmare 5-9. The stairs trap was supposed to be my next stop, and with it the long concrete switchback behind Jamaica Center, where the city narrows people down into a line. I started writing the climb again in my head. The warm light from a deli above, the cold draft from a subway entrance, how the stairwell bends at the landing and the world compresses into a rectangle of floor and railing. But as I looked down the paragraph I'd planned, the details kept spinning toward the same two images, one man blocking the top, another creeping up from below, and the rhythm of footsteps that forms a funnel. The memory arrived as breathless and quick as the escape itself, and my hand slowed because this night folds directly into the next cluster of patterns I need to expose. I remember the smell of metal, coins, a keychain rubbing against a pocket, and the suddenness of being hemmed in on both sides by bodies that had arranged themselves into a corridor. The bottom step felt colder than the rest, as if the city had poured shadow into that narrow strip of concrete. There was no dramatic shout. It was a soft, controlled pressure, men who used their bodies like timing devices. They asked for my phone, as if rehearsing lines, and when I realized how close the waiting car was at the stair's mouth, I moved. I set my shoulder, ran for the top, and used the only object I had, my keys, pressed between my fingers like a clasped coin. I struck, not to injure but to startle. The deli owner above heard the commotion and came to the door. The attackers melted toward an idling sedan and disappeared into the alley. Police wrote down what I could remember, said it sounded like the kind of stairway tactic they'd been getting calls about, and left me with a list of vague reassurances and an escort to the transit line. The memory after the stairs is one of rearranged routes, different exits, different times, deliberate avoidance. I stopped taking that stairwell at night, and I stopped assuming the city's crowd would be enough to protect me. The pattern, funnel people into narrow spaces and then control the exits, kept showing up in my head when I walked anywhere pedestrian tunnels funneled into a single door. A motif starts to settle into place. The scar through the left eyebrow, the pale eyes, the delivery truck as a shield, disabled cameras at key angles. The city's infrastructure is a set of entrances and exits, and someone who studies them can turn them into doors that close on you. Nightmare 6-9, the Ramble ambush. I went into the Ramble for the same reason I always did, because it quieted something that city noise couldn't touch. My camera felt like an extension of my hands, a way to translate the green into something other people could understand. The path was familiar, a narrow ribbon between roots and fallen leaves, where light fell in strips through the oaks. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the park forgets whether it's day or night. Joggers thin out, and shadows grow long and patient. I saw them as I passed a knot of vines, 3 silhouettes that folded their shapes into the path like a practiced geometry. For a heartbeat, my brain read them as people stopping to talk, 2 figures leaning and one standing straight. The leader, with his profile cut by a thin, pale line, a scar that ran through his left eyebrow and stopped the way an accent stops a word. The scar looked like something you'd notice in a story, not in a real life, and noticing it made me feel silly for looking at it at all until it stopped being silly and became a direction. Their voices were low and polite at first, the kind of small talk that plants you in place while something else moves in. One of them asked about my camera, about lenses and light, as if we were the same club. Then the leader stepped forward, and the triangle they'd made tightened like a fist. He said, softly and without theatrics, that it was nothing personal, just business. They wanted my pockets emptied, my camera bag opened. My pockets turned out like a line in customs. The scarred man's hand brushed the strap of my camera with a casual examining touch. His companions split, one toward the trees, one toward the path behind me, shrinking the angles I could use to leave. The sound of his palm on leather is a thing I replay often. Not a slap, but a measuring, the way someone checks the seam of a garment. His scarred eyebrow caught a strip of light when he tilted his head, and I catalogued it like a list, because cataloguing felt like doing something active. My feet had stayed, while my mouth had climbed a ladder of excuses. Then the leader said a thing that made the whole act legal-sounding. Nobody has to get hurt. His voice used that permissive cadence that makes threats sound like common-sense rules. There was a small suddenness that saved me, the kind you don't plan for but that arrives like a reflex. A jogger rounded the bend, a woman in a blue jacket breathing hard, her shoes slapping a rhythm that broke the triangle's geometry. She shouted something to a friend further back, then stopped when she saw us. The scarred man looked at her and then back at me, and for one of those seconds the show they'd been conducting lost its direction. I lunged toward the jogger, not away from the men, but toward the potential witness. The men shoved and cursed and made a move that turned from annoyance into panic when Christine the jogger grabbed my sleeve and screamed my name. Though she didn't know me, she used my camera strap to yank me with force into the path of other park-goers who had started to look over. They scattered. The leader's hands went to pockets, and by the time police came, flush and out of breath from multiple 911 calls, the three were already a pair of jackets in the trees. My camera and memory card were gone. The police took my statement. Officers searched, but the attackers had vanished into the park's braided trails. I stood with my hands in my jacket and felt the hollow that theft left inside me. Losing the camera felt like losing a piece of my voice. Losing the images on the card felt like someone had taken memory itself. The aftermath lasted longer than I thought it would. I stopped going into the ramble alone. I bought a smaller, less inviting camera because the old one, the one that had felt like my father's extension, inherited and alive, had become a marker I associated with being targeted. At night, the scarred man's face appears as a flash, an emblem in dreams that forces me to wake and check my locked doors. The park that used to collect my thoughts now holds the memory of hands that arranged themselves like a trap. Police told me they would patrol the area for weeks, and that there had been reports of similar groups using the park's dense foliage as cover. The case remained open as far as I was told, but the memory card, the camera, and the men were all listed under unknown. Same pattern, different props. The park's solitude became a stage for an organized theft. The scar through the eyebrow appears again later as a motif. The next scene involves a man with a tiny ring and a rhythmic tap on a subway car lever. The city's metal mouth opened in the wrong place. Nightmare 7-9. The empty car lever. I'd boarded a train that felt like an emptied theater. The majority of seats were vacant, and the lighting made every small motion larger. End cars attract a certain kind of solitude. It's where you go to isolate, to finish an email, or to sink into a podcast until you're stop. I found a window seat and put my bag between my legs. The car's hum was steady, comforting in the way machinery can be. He followed. He didn't do it in a way that made me say, "Someone is following me." It was smaller, a shuffle of feet, the weight of his packs near the door, and then the sound of him plinking a metal object against a handrail, as if checking his keys. He sat, not adjacent but one seat over, the kind of placement that allows a person to appear non-threatening while measuring your exits. He kept glancing at the connecting release lever, the little bar that drops the gap for inter-car passage, and his hand moved toward it with an almost absent-minded rhythm, tapping it once, twice, 3 times. He had a ring on one finger, a silver band worn smooth at the edges, and when the light caught it, I noticed how he touched the lever at the same time he rubbed the ring. The ring became the metronome for the whole scene. That motion put a cadence into the car's air, a beat I keyed my breathing to without meaning to. At the next stop, he blocked the exit just enough to make the doorway feel like a decision you had to step through. Do you leave and risk an encounter in a narrow stairwell, or stay and risk the man 2 rows over? When he started to talk, his voice was flat, uneventful. He didn't shout, he didn't brandish. He simply said, "No one moves," and the ring tapped the metal again. My hands tightened into fists around my bag strap. A few people looked up, but then looked away. The social scripts in the car are excellent at manufacturing indifference. He said something about making this quick, and reached toward his pocket, where the glint of a small blade caught the light like a tiny promise. I had rehearsed escape routes in my head for years, without naming them as training. In the second between when he leaned forward to reach my lap and the car's outer doors opened one station over, I made a decision that felt both absurd and essential. I would time my dash to when the platform emptied of the new boarding passengers. At the stop, a small swarm of people pushed toward the doors. A school group, loud and moving as one body. I stepped back, wrapped my bag tight, and when the surge toward the exit created a human current, I lunged through, not toward the man, but into the press of bodies that spilled onto the platform. He didn't follow beyond the car. Someone on the platform called out to me, asking if I was okay. Transit police met me at the stair, eyes scanning the car. They said the man had not left the car when they boarded, and that he had not pursued me past the doors. The police took my information and a description of the ring and the tapping. They acknowledged that end cars could be targeted because they are quieter and often have fewer cameras. I stopped riding end cars at night. I rearranged my commute and began choosing sections of trains where there were more people, even if it meant a longer ride. The ring, the lever, the quiet tapping, small details that had felt almost innocuous, now live in the back of my mind when I stand at the edge of a platform. The city's metal belly has places where you are more and less visible. Those places matter in a way they didn't before. Police checked the train and the car, but the suspect had not followed me past the doors. They recorded the incident and listed it with other similar reports of end-car tactics. The methods are recognizable now. Create a gap, reduce witnesses, use a small tool as a threat. The next night's story moves the scene indoors again, into corridors labeled staff only, and a basement where loss looked like an assembly line. Nightmare 8-9, the hotel basement. We were a small group on a school trip, tired and louder than we should have been in the hotel's quiet corridors. I was with Andrew and a couple of classmates, each of us carrying backpacks that smelled faintly of cafeteria coffee and museum dust. Late that night, we realized 2 students had locked themselves out of their rooms. The maintenance desk was down a flight of stairs, and a man in a housekeeping polo offered to escort them. He was soft-spoken and wore a name patch. The patch gave a kind of bureaucratic credibility that made us ease our anxiety like a hand lowering in the air. He led us through a staff-only door that opened into a place that smelled different, not the perfume of the lobby, but the cloying, metallic tang of an industrial sink and chemical cleaners. The corridor had low ceilings. It sloped and wound, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that put your teeth on edge. He said he'd get the master key, and that it would be faster if we waited in the basement area by the storage bins. The sign on the door read something like, "No guests." The basement was not an accumulation of random lost items. It was an archive. Rows of clear plastic bins sat on metal shelves, and in each bin were smartphones, wallets, IDs, items sorted and labeled. Each label had a date and a shorthand that looked like inventory. My stomach tightened at the sight of a passport with an imprint of a different city's stamp. The man who had escorted us along the corridor laughed softly and said these things turn up all the time. He used that phrasing like a way to normalize what it meant to hold someone else's life in a tub. There was choreography in the way the lights flickered, in the way the maintenance man pointed us toward a back staircase that would return us to the lobby, and in the way the elevator board flashed an out of service when we tried to take it. When phones started receiving strange texts, short notes that said simply, "We saw you," the group line tightened. Someone suggested we leave then and there, but the staff man blocked the exit with an apology that made us hesitate. "We'll sort this out in the morning. Let me move you to a different room." It felt like a script. Andrew pushed back, asking for the manager. The man's demeanor shifted. He asked for our IDs just to verify the rooms. The bins in the basement made the request feel like part of a workflow. I remember the sound of my own breathing becoming an object I could study, shallow, fast, as if it were a small instrument for measuring the distance between what felt safe and what didn't. We refused to hand over more than necessary. We kept our passports and cards in our pockets and made a conscious choice to not follow the staff man into any more back rooms. We left that night. The front desk moved us into a different room in the morning, and later that day a couple of parents demanded answers, and the hotel gave a statement about an internal review. The students who had their items missing had their wallets and phones, numeric details and the physical property listed in the bins. It felt less like an isolated theft and more like a system. We filed police reports. Officers came and photographed the piles of objects we'd described. The investigation, confided to us in clipped sentences, was ongoing, and the status was given the cautious language of under review and being looked into. I started taping my peephole shut with Andrew because the idea of eyes on our room felt too intimate now. We placed luggage at the door when we slept and set alarms to go off at any unexpected sound. My trust in the marked areas, the staff corridors, the rooms behind service doors, was altered. The hotel's public face still smiled at guests, but the memory of labeled plastic bins lives in my mind like a small archive of what can go wrong when the people meant to protect you are indistinguishably mixed with those who would take advantage. Police were notified and photographs were taken of the organized bins. The investigation into the organized thefts was described to us as ongoing, with no immediate arrests reported. The city shows a seam. The places meant for service and maintenance are also places someone can exploit. The final nightmare in this set takes us off the urban grid to a highway and then to a motel room window where the tapping of glass becomes a threat that follows a very ordinary stop. Nightmare 99. The highway setup and motel tap. I was driving alone on a stretch of highway that runs like a thin artery out of the city. The sun had sunk and the radio was on, a hum underneath the thought that I still had a few hours to spare before reaching a town where a motel sign glowed like a promise. Then I saw the car at the side of the road, an SUV with hazard lights blinking in a way that seemed practiced. A man stood by the rear, leaning against the bumper and waving at passing cars. He had a small flag in his hand and an expression like someone working a role. I called 911 before I slowed enough to reach the shoulder. I wanted to record the interaction in the exact same place as a witness would. I kept us moving and kept a distance, then pulled into the next town, rather than the one he pointed to. The highway is full of stories like this, people who use the openness of the shoulder as a way to reduce witness density. And my call to 911 felt like one more name on a long list of the city's peripheral dangers. A patrol car later found the SUV empty. With a rug that suggested a staged breakdown and nothing else, the man was gone. Still, the worry clung to me, viscous and patient. When I pulled into a motel that night, I asked for a room away from the highway, but the clerk, cordial and a little distracted, gave me a ground-floor room and a face that said, "We're full." At midnight there was a tapping at the window. The sound was light at first, like a polite knock, fingernails on glass tapping a rhythm that made my skin want to crawl. I looked through the curtain and saw the silhouette of a person at the parking lot railing, the outline of their shoulders highlighted by a lone street lamp. I went to the front desk and asked for help. The clerk's eyes tracked to the window and then to the name on my reservation, and he said, apologies lined out in practiced tones, that he could move me to the second floor if I wanted. "It's nothing," he said, and then the maintenance guy, 2 minutes later, turned up at the lobby and told me to keep my curtains drawn and not to open the door. The tapping continued in fits, a staccato that made sleep impossible. At one point, a car slowed in the lot, and its headlights painted the blinds, and the tapping stopped as though someone had acknowledged an audience and stepped away. I left at dawn, My hands on the steering wheel were tight. My phone had a new folder called Strange Contacts with the motel's number and the time-stamped calls to dispatch. When I told the police about the car on the highway and the tapping, they listened with a professional distance and said they would check the motel's surveillance cameras. Later I was told the lot had no working footage for that hour and that maintenance had been asked to look into non-functioning cameras. That night changed my relationship with simple acts. Pulling off the highway, checking the far lane parking, opting for well-lit fuel stations. I didn't sleep properly for weeks. I learned how to leave early and avoid the possibility of a second encounter, because the feeling of being followed is different from the physical evidence it sometimes leaves. Police checked the motel and noted the tapping incident, but the suspect was not located, and the surveillance footage that might have helped was reportedly inoperable. Closing. What 9 nights showed us. 9 nights. 9 small stage productions where ordinary choices, taking a camera, waiting at a light, stepping into a subway car, were reframed by others into openings for control. The through line is not a single villain, but a set of techniques. Remove witnesses, choose places where cameras are blind or offline, use props that normalize threat. A delivery truck, a ring, a maintenance badge. Predators study the seams of the city the way a tailor studies fabric, where to fold, where to cut, where to press so that the shape will hold. Across these stories, isolation was the currency. Rooftop storage rooms, end cars, park paths, late-night stairwells, hotel basements, highway shoulders. Each location offered ways for the attacker to narrow options and increase pressure. The city's infrastructure and its failings, poor lighting, disabled cameras, service corridors meant to be private, were not accessories but active elements in how harm was arranged. Many survivors described the same mechanical calm. Voices that were low, hands that were practiced, small tools that acted as signals rather than as blunt instruments. A scar through a left eyebrow, a ring that tapped a lever, pale grey-blue eyes repeating. Recurring images help us map behavior without suggesting the same person committed every act. They are clues to pattern, not proof of a single identity. What saved people in these accounts were micro-decisions, sensory awareness, and sometimes the intervention of strangers. The person who sprayed the box extinguisher, the driver who floored the gas, the passenger who created a loud disturbance on the platform. None of these were guaranteed formulas that will always work, and I won't claim that they are. They were choices made in split seconds, often reflexive, and they bought time or created a new variable that the attacker hadn't rehearsed for. Police response varied, but there is a common notation in every report. Officers listened, took descriptions, searched, and in several cases found nothing. Investigations were launched and in some cases labeled ongoing or under review, but arrests were not always part of the record we were given. That reality is a hard one to hold. The city has resources and limitations, and sometimes evidence that could help, camera footage, reliable witness accounts, is missing by the time it matters most. The survivors changed. They moved neighborhoods, stopped riding certain subway cars, rearranged routes, purchased smaller cameras, taped peepholes, slept with luggage by the door, adopted back seats in ride shares. They didn't become experts overnight. They learned, and they carried the learning like a bandage. Trauma was as much a daily recalibration as it was a memory. Hypervigilance, the replaying of small details, the way a particular scar or sound could make a stomach drop. This is not a call to live in fear of the city. It is a call to recognize that the city, for all its vibrancy, has moments of engineered emptiness. To move through it safely means treating small things with the seriousness they deserve, knowing your exits, keeping a phone where you can reach it, trusting the friction in your gut when something feels off. Those are not guarantees. They are not promises. They are accounts of what worked for some people in moments when options were narrow. If you've heard part of yourself in these stories, know this. Your reaction is not something to be judged. Survivors did what they could with the information and body they had in the moment. We hold their choices with respect, and we remember that escape can look like running, bargaining, screaming, fighting, or simply surviving long enough for help to arrive. The city still hums at all hours. It still offers shelter, work, and the small, luminous moments that make life possible. But a shared truth emerges from these 9 nights. Predators exploit isolation, damaged infrastructure, and social scripts that teach people to be polite even when danger asks for a different answer. Awareness is not a weapon. It's practice in reading the map of risk and choosing routes that tilt probability in your favor. If you're carrying any of these memories now, you're not alone. Many of the people whose nights I've told still carry them too. Scars that are as much habits as they are wounds. Some moved across the river to feel safer. Some learned a new commute. Some simply breathe differently at night. All of them keep going. If these stories mattered to you, consider sharing them with someone who might need to hear them. If you have a memory or a small safety habit that helped you in a tight moment, leave it in the comments. Your experience might be the piece of information someone else needs. And if you want to hear more survivor voices told with care, subscribe and tap the bell. There are more stories to listen to, more patterns to notice, and always more people worth giving space to. One last image. Sometimes when I lock my door at night, I run my thumb along a small seam on the camera strap I still carry. It's a gesture that is part memory and part promise, a way of keeping what I can close at hand and remembering how fragile the margin between an ordinary night and a nightmare can be. Police were involved in many of these incidents. In some cases they searched and files were opened, and in others the trail went cold. None of that undoes what happened. What it does is remind us that vigilance and compassion must travel together. Watch for the seams and hold those who pass through them with care.